For this episode, I have something a little unique. I recorded the following special episode after learning the news that Garth Lagerwey, previous president of Atlanta United, is heading to Burnley in the EFL Championship to become head of football operations. After commenting on some posts by some popular Burnley fan accounts and podcast accounts on X, I started getting inundated with questions from Burnley supporters about Garth and my perspective on his time at Atlanta United as a fan. And so I recorded the following as an overview of Garth Lagerwey's career in MLS, specifically for Burnley supporters or really anyone unfamiliar with Major League Soccer. I spent some time explaining how MLS works for those unfamiliar with the league, so if that isn't something that interests you, feel free to turn this off now. But if you're an MLS nerd and are willing to sit through that part in order to hear my breakdown of his career and my opinion of his time in Atlanta, well, then enjoy the rest of the episode. Recent news revealed that Burnley just hired Garth Lagerwey. And here are some of my thoughts on Garth and what I think Burnley supporters might like to know. So as I said, recent reports indicate that Burnley have hired Garth Lagerwey to lead what they call football operations. And so if you're a Burnley supporter who found this while trying to learn more about the man who may help shape the future of your club, I guess this episode is for you. So Garth Lagerwey is actually a fascinating figure in Major League Soccer, and I consumed everything I could possibly know about the man when it was first announced that he would be coming to Atlanta United. So I dived back into some of those notes and then refreshed my memory by doing some additional research before recording this. Now, depending on who you ask, he's either one of the most successful executives in MLS history, or he could be viewed as a cautionary tale about how quickly success can become difficult to sustain in a rapidly changing league like Major League Soccer. And the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. And that's what I'm going to explore today. So with that, let's dive right in. Now, Garth became general manager of Real Salt Lake in 2007. And at the time, Major League Soccer consisted of only just 13 teams. Very small compared to championship level. The league was smaller, and the budgets were very small, and front offices were tiny. And the gap between a well-organized team or a well-run organization and a poorly run organization was often much wider than it is today. Real Salt Lake was hardly one of MLS's glamour clubs. You're talking about, MLS really trying to bring spotlight to the league at the time through teams like LA Galaxy, bringing in big name players that retired from England, et cetera. People will often remember, Beckham as the big example, or Steven Gerrard, among others. But under Lagerwey's leadership, the club became one of the league's model organizations at the time. RSL won MLS Cup in 2009, and it reached the CONCACAF Champions League final in 2011. It consistently punched above its weight, despite operating outside of what would be considered MLS's largest markets at the time. And that may already start to sound familiar to Burnley supporters when talking about a club that needs to find value rather than simply outspend rivals, and has to be smart about how they find players and provide value, or even finding players that can outperform their salary compared to the competition with bigger treasuries and teams that splash cash to bring in big name players. Now, fast forward to 2015, Lagerwey's success at RSL attracted the attention of the Seattle Sounders, which had been established 6 years prior in 2009. And so Lagerwey left Real Salt Lake and joined the Seattle Sounders. By this point, MLS had grown to 20 teams. And for perspective, by the time Lagerwey left Seattle, the league had expanded to 28 teams. So the league was aggressively growing during his tenure, at RSL and then now at Seattle. And this is where his reputation, I think, was truly established. So Seattle, under his tenure, reached 4 MLS Cup finals. From that, they won MLS Cups in 2016 and 2019. Seattle also became the first MLS club to win the modern CONCACAF Champions League in 2022. And throughout most of his tenure, the Sounders were among the most consistent teams in Major League Soccer. But before I go further, it's probably worth explaining how Major League Soccer works for listeners who may not follow American soccer or Major League Soccer. MLS is divided into two conferences, the Eastern Conference and the Western Conference. Teams play a regular season, okay, from around February all the way through December, the playoffs that can lead all the way into December. But unlike England, the season does not simply end with the league table determining the champion. Instead, teams qualify under a more Americanized model for the MLS Cup playoffs. And the playoffs ultimately determine who wins the MLS Cup trophy. The closest comparison I could give to English supporters would be the EFL Championship promotion playoffs. Although it's definitely not a perfect comparison, similarity is that a team that finishes lower in the table can still qualify for the playoffs and still end up winning the league's biggest trophy. Whereas, in the championship, obviously you could finish, say, sixth, enter the playoffs, and still end up being promoted, winning promotion to the Premier League. So because of that, many American supporters place greater importance on the MLS Cup than they do on finishing first in the regular season standings. And I would say winning the MLS Cup is generally viewed as the ultimate prize. And so making the playoffs is often considered a successful season, depending on the ambitions of the club. But that being said, the regular season still does matter, and more fans are starting to place increased significance in finishing first in the overall league table. The team that does finish with the best record across the entire league wins what's called the Supporters' Shield. No playoffs, no knockout rounds, just the best team over the course of the entire season. And this is where Garth Lagerwey's record becomes particularly interesting. So his teams won trophies, and his teams made the playoffs consistently, but neither Real Salt Lake nor Seattle teams won a Supporters' Shield during his tenure. In other words, despite all the success, none of his teams ever finished first overall in MLS. Now, that definitely doesn't diminish the championships, and that's far from it in MLS. But it does reveal something about the teams he tended to build. They were resilient. They tended to start to perform very well towards the end of the season. They were very difficult to eliminate in playoff scenarios and were just very excellent in playoff knockout positions. But they were not necessarily dominant across the entire league season, which, with the MLS roster and player recruitment rules in place, is actually extremely difficult to achieve due to how much parity there is in the league. It's not uncommon to see a team win MLS Cup one season and then finish close to the bottom of the league the following season. So for Burnley supporters, that's an important distinction. Obviously, English football culture traditionally places enormous emphasis on league position and consistency over a full season. American sports culture often places greater emphasis on playoff success. But they're just different ways of defining success, and understanding the difference is important when evaluating Lagerwey's career. Now, let me go back to his time in Seattle. During his 8 seasons there, Seattle averaged roughly a 4th place finish in the Western Conference and approximately 7th overall in MLS. Now, as a reminder, that was initially out of 20 teams in the league when he started there, and out of 28 by the time he left after 2022. So the Sounders never finished below 4th in the West until the final. Actually, that's not true. They I would say hovered around 4th place, sometimes finishing 2nd, 6th, etc. Had an outlier where they finished 10th, but largely, again, they're averaged around that 4th, 5th place in the Western Conference until the final season of his tenure, and qualified for the playoffs for every year except for, I believe, his last season. So most importantly, his spending versus value philosophy carried over to Seattle, where they achieved the success without consistently being the biggest spenders in the league. Now, according to data from the MLS Players Association, who started publishing player salary data in 2007, Seattle's average payroll was around $13 million during the course of his tenure. Now, significant spending, but rarely the highest spending compared to other teams during his tenure. The Sounders built a reputation for finding value, identifying talent among veteran MLS players, and getting more production per dollar than many of their competitors. And a major part of that success involved the people around him, and that's important to signify. Brian Schmetzer became one of the league's most successful coaches in the history of MLS, and Chris Henderson became one of the most respected sporting directors, working alongside Garth in MLS at Seattle. And that made Seattle feel like a well-functioning machine. So when Atlanta United hired Lagerwey as president and CEO on November 22nd of 2022, expectations were understandably enormous. The fan base, I would say, was very excited. League analysts said it was a shrewd move by Atlanta at the time and was praised pretty much by everybody. However, one caveat to note is that some Seattle supporters argued that there were signs of decline appearing in Seattle before his departure to Atlanta. Seattle did miss the playoffs for the first time in club history during Lagerwey's final season. Some supporters felt he appeared increasingly focused on his next challenge and, quote unquote, checked out his last couple of seasons with the team. But again, others disagree with that characterization. So that's up to debate between Seattle fans. So that raises the question, was 2022, his last year, simply an anomaly, or was it a warning sign of things to come? It's really impossible to know. But moving on, here's some background on Atlanta United before Garth's arrival as new president of soccer to sort of set the ground. Atlanta United got an early taste of success, making the playoffs in their first inaugural season in 2017 and winning an MLS Cup in their second year in 2018 under the coaching of then Tata Martino, President Darren Eales, who Garth ultimately replaced and who went to Newcastle United later on, and sporting director Carlos Bocanegra, who Garth ended up inheriting as sporting director. The team was also definitely not afraid to spend money. Atlanta United often got criticized by opposing team fans at the time for buying a trophy due to their record-setting wage bill at the time. And so expectations were very high, as we as fans, as Atlanta United fans, largely believed they were hiring the closest thing that MLS had to a proven championship architect, I would say. So at first, the challenge seemed relatively straightforward for Garth. Atlanta at the time, and still is, a club with massive resources and ambitious ownership group under Arthur Blank, a billionaire owner of Home Depot, or one of the owners of Home Depot, and one of the largest league's largest fan bases, selling more tickets really than any other team, and has a history of spending money. And his objective really was to fix at the time a team that has started to lose its way, missing the playoffs, finishing 24th out of 26 teams in 2020, making the playoffs and finishing 11th overall in 2021, but then missing the playoffs again, finishing 23rd out of 28th in 2022. So coming in, Garth inherited Carlos Bocanegra as sporting director and Gonzalo Pineda as head coach. Now, there were reports and perceptions later around the club that Lagerwey was never entirely convinced Pineda was a long-term answer. And the reality was that Atlanta soccer operations were already in place, and any significant changes would arguably take some time. So when Garth came in, again, his philosophy, which he communicated again and again when he came to Atlanta in interviews and at press conferences, and he pleaded for patience, was this importance for long-term health of a club over big spending. He literally told fans, be patient, and asked to give him, 2 or 3 windows to enact real change. He made comments that seemed to indicate he was not really of an aggressive approach. He's not a guy to come in and start firing people or making drastic changes. He did show quickly, though, that he has a passion for data. And he did this by actually quickly enhancing the data analytics and sports science divisions. But he left the player recruitment department under Jonathan Spector alone and seemed to be more hands-off when it came to roster building, really allowing then sporting director Carlos Bocanegra to kind of do his thing. So what happened after he arrived in terms of results? Well, the results initially looked respectable enough. With the roster that Garth pretty much inherited, Atlanta finished sixth in the Eastern Conference in 2023 and 12th overall in MLS. Not spectacular, but certainly an improvement and a playoff caliber season. In 2024, however, is when it came time for Garth to make his imprint on the club. And that's when they slipped to 13th by the summer in the Eastern Conference. And Coach Pineda was ultimately fired. And the team did end up improving a bit, finishing ninth in the Eastern Conference, which allowed them to make the playoffs. And they finished 20th overall in the league at the time. Now, while supporters will rightly remember the dramatic playoff run that Atlanta had under interim coach Valentino, that included a famous upset over Lionel Messi's Supporter Shield winning Inter Miami, the regular season told a different story. Over the course of 34 matches, Atlanta had become pretty much a below average MLS team. And what happened next is probably where the conversation becomes more interesting. So for years, Lagerwey's reputation had been built on efficiency. The Seattle teams rarely dominated the payroll rankings. They won really because they consistently found value and extracted more production from the roster than many of the competitors. And then sporting director Carlos Bocanegra left Atlanta, and Garth reunited with his sporting director from his time in Seattle, Chris Henderson, who he hired then in December of 2024. Now, Chris Henderson was brought over from a burgeoning Inter Miami, where they were now the biggest spender in the league. They were the big new shiny thing that MLS was really marketing. And they were now the ones getting the ire of opposing team fans as the ones buying their way to trophies. Garth also brought in a new coach, Ronnie Deila, who had won major trophies in 3 different countries. He had already won MLS Cup with New York City FC as head coach. And Atlanta even specifically highlighted that he brought more than 17 years of head coaching experience and 6 major trophies. That was their big headline when they brought him in. So every decision looked promising on paper, bringing back, the guy that he put together rosters with in Seattle for so many years with Chris, bringing in this experienced coach that had a number of trophies under his belt and including knowledge of Major League Soccer, which was important. And suddenly in 2025, we saw a drastic shift away from Garth's previously touted philosophy, and the Atlanta roster got a big facelift. The headline move was the return of Miguel Almiron. Now, for Atlanta supporters, Almiron wasn't simply a former player. He was arguably one of the most beloved figures in club history. The dynamic attacking midfielder who helped lead Atlanta United to MLS Cup in 2018 before earning a move to Newcastle United. Now, his return was marketed as a return of a star in order to generate excitement through the fan base. However, when you scratch beneath the surface, it started to raise legitimate questions. Atlanta reportedly paid around $10 million to bring Almiron back, while committing roughly what we learned later, $8 million in annual guaranteed compensation. This was no longer the 24-year-old Almiron who left MLS as one of the league's brightest stars. This was a 31-year-old player who had gradually become more of a rotational squad player at Newcastle and was no longer receiving consistent Premier League minutes. So that's important to know. Now, while supporters were thrilled to see him return, in large part, in this nostalgic buy, it didn't represent the type of value-driven decision-making that had defined Lagerwey's earlier success. Now, the second major move generated even more debate. Atlanta paid a reported fee of approximately $22 million to acquire Emmanuel Latte-Lath from Middlesbrough, making him one of the most expensive signings in MLS history. Now, on the surface, the profile appeared attractive. A championship striker entering his prime years, had a lot of pace, and respectable goal-scoring numbers. Yet even before the season began, some supporters and analysts started to ask questions. While the Latte-Lath's raw statistics looked impressive, a deeper look reveals concerns about his consistency finishing efficiency, and whether his strengths would translate to MLS. It also shifted away from the team's cultural roots and history of splashing cash for younger, up-and-coming South American talent that the team would, would play for a couple of seasons and then move on for a profit. So again, this reflected a noticeable shift from the philosophy from the team's own cultural history, as well as the ethos that made Lagerwey, infamous. This was the ethos that he advertised as making himself successful in the first place in terms of value buys and things of that nature. Now we're seeing this big splash for cash and return to big salary budgets. Excuse me. So again, this reflected a noticeable shift from the philosophy from the team's own cultural history. All right. So taken together, these moves represented something Atlanta supporters rarely associated with Garth Lagerwey: enormous financial bets. This executive, who built his reputation on finding undervalued assets among veteran domestic MLS players, now found himself overseeing some of the largest transfer fees and salary commitments in league history, which was more in tune with what we saw with Chris Henderson coming from Inter Miami. So, this was something that was attuned to what Chris Henderson was doing over at Inter Miami, big international signings. But what was different is this included an aging nostalgic acquisition and the team's first investment in a player from the EFL Championship. So this starts to raise some questions. Was Garth panicking? Was it a data-driven approach really telling the team that these were the best acquisitions available for the amount of money being spent? Did Jonathan Spector, the head of player recruitment, really advise the team to target these players? Or were these decisions being overridden by leadership? Or was there pressure being applied by Garth to go with signings that would sell tickets over identifying whether they would be a good fit culturally or tactically in the new coach's system? These are all questions that I don't really have answers to. Now, by 2025, Atlanta's payroll now climbed to roughly $27.6 million, the third highest in Major League Soccer for the 2026 season. The results, however, moved in the opposite direction. And despite that spending, Atlanta United finished 14th out of 15 teams in the Eastern Conference in 2025. So, for the 2025 season. And second to last place overall in the MLS table. This was a resounding failure of epic proportions. The disconnect between spending and performance is impossible to ignore. Now, on July 10th, 2025, Lagerwey stepped away from the club after revealing that he had been battling cancer. And by end of 2025, it was confirmed that he would not return as CEO. So his Atlanta tenure came to an end, but the questions surrounding it remain. Did Garth struggle at Atlanta United because MLS simply became more competitive than ever before? When Lagerwey took over Real Salt Lake, the league had 13 teams. During his Seattle years, expanded from 20 to 28 teams. But again, Seattle fans said that he checked out the last couple of seasons, when the league was at the time at its highest point in terms of the number of teams. And by the time he arrived in Atlanta, MLS had 29 teams and was about to grow to 30. So every expansion club brought new ownership, new scouts, new analysts, and new resources for Garth. The margins became smaller and the competition became stronger. He was no longer the only one investing in data analytics and acquiring top data engineers anymore. Now, was the issue organizational? Many of Lagerwey's greatest successes came within highly stable environments where trusted lieutenants like Brian Schmetzer and Chris Henderson helped execute this shared vision. Now, Atlanta required building multiple layers of the organization simultaneously for Garth. He was dealing with having to deal with an incoming, with an existing sporting director. Maybe he didn't jive with totally. He ended up, after his first year having to replace that sporting director. He went through 2 coaches in 2.5 years. Sporting leadership, coaching leadership, recruitment strategy, and club identity. It all needed attention at the same time. Then again, he brought in his guy, bringing in Chris Henderson didn't appear to fix the problem either. In fact, after Garth left, Chris oversaw what we as fans consider now as a dreadful summer transfer window in 2025. There's also the question of philosophy. Did Atlanta's expectations create pressure on him to accelerate the rebuild? Did Garth move the club away from this patient, value-oriented approach that defined his earlier success toward a model built around marquee signings and headline-grabbing transfer fees? Was there alignment between his analytical approach, the analytics department, scouting, and recruitment, or were different voices pulling in different directions? Was it creating chaos? Some supporters have wondered whether the collaborative ecosystem that fueled his success in Seattle never fully materialized in Atlanta. Other questions whether the increasing reliance on data-driven decision-making combined with the larger, more complex recruitment structure may have created tension between identifying players, statistically and evaluating those players, and how they would actually fit within the realities of MLS, and also culturally how they would fit together as a roster. In reality, the truth is I don't know. I don't know the answers to these questions. What I do know is that the Atlanta chapter of his career looks dramatically different from the RSL and Seattle chapters. And so this brings us back to Burnley. Now, I'm no historical expert on Burnley as a town or their entire club history, but I have been an avid watcher of the Premier League since 2002 and the EFL Championship some years later. But forgive me for my ignorance, Burnley supporters, and feel free to reach out if I get any of these facts wrong. So, according to my research, Burnley is a town of about roughly 80,000 people. It's not one of England's largest markets by any standard, and it doesn't possess the financial advantages of many of its competitors. But Burnley has spent years yo-yoing between Championship and Premier League, punching above its weight. In my opinion, that really resembles many of the environments where Lagerwey built his reputation. Real Salt Lake was not a glamour destination. Burnley isn't one either. Success required smart decisions, efficient recruitment, long-term thinking. But there's the other side to this challenge. MLS operates under a salary cap and extensive roster restrictions. So for those of you who don't know, MLS has very strict rules and regulations in order to force parity across the league. Okay, so that, the idea is that it tries to prevent, a single team that can just outspend and spend its way to trophies. Now, that doesn't always work, but it has shown that it's difficult to maintain that level of quality consistently year after year for a team. They might do it for a year or two, and then after that, they may fall back to mid-table or even bottom of the table. It's a very difficult league to compete in. And although top spending teams in MLS are now getting close to the type of spending you'd see by teams fighting for playoff positions in the championship, MLS teams still generally operate on payrolls that are modest compared to any championship clubs. Okay. The championship is an entirely different environment. You've got 24 clubs, 46 matches, parachute payments, promotions worth enormous sums of money, and what many consider the most competitive league in the world of football. The margins are razor thin, the pressure is relentless, and mistakes are expensive. If I was a Burnley supporter, I would probably view this appointment through a couple of different lenses. The optimistic view is that Burnley have hired a proven builder, an executive who spent nearly 2 decades creating successful organizations, winning trophies, and helping clubs outperform their resources. The cautious view is that his most recent project went horribly wrong. Atlanta spent more money than ever, the results became worse, and the philosophy that was once emphasized by him as using efficiency appeared increasingly difficult to identify during his time at Atlanta. So which version of Garth Lagerwey is Burnley getting? The executive who helped build champions in Salt Lake and Seattle, or the executive who presided over Atlanta's decline? I would say the answer probably lies somewhere in between. Now, maybe Atlanta exposed weaknesses in his approach. Maybe MLS became more competitive than ever before, and he just couldn't deal with it. Maybe he became too dependent on others below him to make footballing and roster building decisions while he focused on more of a data-driven approach. Or maybe his health issues started sooner than we know and impacted his ability to be as closely involved with operations as he normally would. Whatever the explanation, Burnley represents a fascinating test of his career. Because if Lagerwey can help a small-town club outperform wealthier rivals and return to the Premier League, it will look remarkably similar to the story that made his reputation in the first place. But if he can't, and you get the Atlanta United version of Garth Lagerwey, and he fails, Atlanta may ultimately be remembered not as the exception to his career, but as a warning sign. So for Burnley supporters, that's the question. And over the next few years, they're going to find out the answer. So with that, thank you for listening. Much appreciated.